Hey guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. As you know, this is a place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic, presenting what is most factual and logically consistent. So today I'm going to be covering a recent show that Norman Finkelstein had with on the Glenn show, where he discussed with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, the black guys of bloggingheads.tv. So the conversation was around the October 7th atrocity by Hamas, that massacre by Hamas, and whether it was inevitable given the conditions that Palestinians have found themselves for decades. So Norman's argument took into consideration the historical context and the occupation and the dispossession of Palestinians and the continued suppression of Palestinians. He was quite frank with the idea that yes, Hamas did commit atrocities on October 7th. But then, just like the Nat Turner, would I call that insurrection? Just like the Nat Turner event during slavery, his argument was that what did you expect when you put people under certain conditions? What do you expect was going to happen when you push people to the wall? What do you expect that they're going to do? Human beings they love freedom, especially when it comes to do when it has to do with another group imposing upon them their will. At a certain point in time, they're going to revolt. So he was trying to make John McWhorter understand the nuances of the event. And even John himself, he admitted that this is a complex situation. Despite that, John wanted a simplistic answer to certain questions. And he sort of got frustrated when Norman Finkelstein was giving a nuanced answer. Well, you know how Finkelstein speaks, he takes his time, he speaks in a very slow pace. So if you don't really like him, if you don't really like his points, you might get frustrated and irritated by his speaking style. But if you are able to, just sit through it, if you're able to be patient enough to allow him finish his points, you're going to see that he's making a lot of sense. So we're going to cover that now. We're going to look at that conversation between Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, and Norman Finkelstein. So let's get into it.
We are live, The Glenn Show. And I am the host of The Glenn Show, Glenn Lowry. I am joined by my conversation partner over many years, John McWhorter. And we have a full show today, 2 hours. We are with Norman Finkelstein, whom I'll introduce more properly in a moment, in the first hour, and Eli Lake, who of the Free Press, a political writer about Middle Eastern affairs, amongst other things, in the second hour. I'm going to turn it over to Mark Sussman, creative director is Nikita Petrov, who's not on the screen, but Mark Sussman is writer and editor at glennlowry.substack, and he's going to talk a little bit about the logistics for the show. Mark.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much for coming to our latest live stream here at TGS. If you are
and assessing the way in which the international community, the human rights community, the United.
So let's just skip all that.
Current book, new book to be published next month, if I'm not mistaken, is Gaza's Gravediggers: An Inquiry into Corruption in High Places. Thanks for joining us, Norman.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Gaza lays in waste. The dust hasn't yet settled, though, on this conflict. You are making an intervention here and now, a forceful intervention, assessing the way in which the international community, the human rights community, the United Nations and others have dealt with what you don't call a war, you call it a genocide. Tell us about why the gravedigger metaphor is being used in the title of your book, and what is the corruption in high places that you undertake to expose here?
Well, first of all, I have to enter, before even saying anything, I have to enter a caveat. The perpetrators of the genocide in Gaza were obviously not primarily international institutions, let alone international legal institutions. And I would say until the end of 2025, the record in general was decent. In particular, the International Court of Justice, which in my opinion, with one exception on the court, acquitted itself honorably. So the main perpetrators of the genocide are not the subject of my book. I focus on international institutions, human rights organizations, because I think rightfully one does and should have higher moral and legal expectations of them. And there were certain areas where, in my opinion, they fell short. And in some places, they fell very short. And it's on those institutions that I focus, and on their failures that I focus. But obviously, the genocide was perpetrated by Israel. It was critically aided and abetted by the United States, and a broad swath of states, with the exception of only a handful like South Africa, went along, acquiesced in the genocide in Gaza, and they are the main perpetrators of it.
Norman,
Yes.
do you think that and I'm coming at this kind of like a child, but I think that all people need to always be able to start from the bottom of these things. Do you think that Hamas should have been left in power the way it was, in which case they would almost certainly have continued in their mission, and that would have been better than the number of Palestinians who very unfortunately were killed? In other words, this is the grand old question: what should they have done? That's a question.
Well, I don't want to belabor you right now with going.
So I think that's a fair question. It's an interesting question. However, just before Finkelstein gives his answer, I'm going to ask because Finkelstein is going to make reference to slavery and all that. So let me use part of his example. Do you think that enslaved people, maybe let's say African Americans, do you think that they had a right to freedom? Do you think they had the right to overthrow their slave masters, even by violent means? And if that happens, if they attempt to do that, and the rebellion or the revolt is put down violently, do you think it's a fair question to ask whether those who perpetrated that revolt, those slaves who rose up and took matters into their hands, whether they should be left in power or whether they should be killed? From the get-go, the conditions on ground makes it such that the aggrieving party almost loses the right to act, because it is their aggression, it is their whatever they're doing, it is what stimulated that event to begin with. Now, that's not to say that event you're talking about is good or not. But if you institute a slave system, you are the slaveholder is in a morally and legally inferior position to the slaves. And under international law, occupied people have the right to armed resistance. They have the right to overthrow their occupiers by any means possible. Well, I'll let Norman answer that question.
Going through the entire history of what happened beginning in 1948 when it was under Egyptian rule, and even during that period of Egyptian rule, international actors who served in Gaza, they described it as a concentration camp. Already in July 1967, when Al Gore Sr., not his son, Al Gore Sr., who was a senator, when he visited Gaza in July 1967, he described it as a concentration camp on the sand, if you will. That's his quote. By 2004, when Israel's head of national security, Giora Eiland, met with American officials, he described it as, quote, and I should note that Giora Eiland is very far from a peacenik, this former head of the Israeli National Security Council. He's still very much with us. During the Gaza genocide, he said publicly that if epidemics break out in the south of Gaza, that will be a good thing. So he's not exactly what you would call, say, John Lennon in 1969. So he described Gaza as, quote, a huge concentration camp.
I am a very bad interrupter, and I avoid doing it because for some reason I look more imperious doing it than most people. But Norman, if I may, and I say this with great deference, but this is the kid in me again. I feel like you're evading my question, which really was, what would you have done in 2023?
No. He's, he is giving a preamble, but he's not evading the question. He hasn't finished answering your question yet. He's giving you background and he's giving you context. And for anyone with two brain cells who understands the conflict, you know where Norman Finkelstein is going to. It's not just going to come out and tell you a yes or no answer. He's going to try to explain to you why this happened. And before he gives you the answer to what should Israel do, you are the occupying force. Stop the occupation. That's any answer that doesn't start from how do you end this occupation first? It doesn't make any sense. Stop the occupation. And I keep saying it that part of the reason why Israel remains in a morally inferior position is that you are essentially instituting an apartheid system. You are occupying people's lands. If Palestine was a sovereign country, was a sovereign nation of itself, and the Palestinians attacked Israel, I think Israel is morally justified to carry out, whatever it has done now in Gaza. They're morally justified because an independent state attacked them. But that's not the case. In fact, this is essentially the same state in which some people have rights and other people do not. So, yes, you've got to fix that injustice first. That's the first place to start from. Not what should they have done. The right thing to do is end the bloody occupation, allow for the existence of or the creation of a Palestinian state. Then the contest becomes one between peers. So, but that's not what's happening currently.
I'm going to get to that. I do not evade questions, to my knowledge.
Okay.
However, questions sometimes require background, or I should say responses require background in order to understand the decision that Hamas made on October 7th, 2023. What I just described to you, or what I just echoed the sentiments of others, what I just described was Gaza in its best days. That's a fact. That was Gaza in its best days. When Hamas was elected into power in 2006, Israel and then the United States and then the EU imposed a brutal medieval siege on Gaza. And by 2008-9, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said of Gaza, quote, "A total civilization is being destroyed." I'm not exaggerating. A total civilization is being destroyed. That's 2008-9.
So my question to John will be, given these conditions that the Palestinians were living under, what should they have done? When they tried peaceful means, they were shot by Israeli snipers. No, they've exhausted almost all options that they have. And when people exhaust peaceful means, what they resort to is violence. That's why it is very important for you, for people to have other means of expressing themselves, for people to have the right to resolve a conflict via legal and non-violent means. But when you take away all those options, that's naturally what they're left with, and that's what they're going to resort to. So if in Gaza's best days, it was being described as a concentration camp, an open air prison, where people they cannot determine their own future, where they are under siege, what do you expect them to do?
Now, to get to your question, I think we can all agree, and I believe that Len Lowry has said on several occasions, but I could be mistaken, that we can all agree the conditions in Gaza were horrific before October 7th, 2023.
Enter the medieval age, choose your civilization, and begin your path to conquest. Build
Gaza, here I don't have the time to go through the detail. Hamas attempted diplomacy. Hamas attempted to use or leverage international law. Hamas attempted nonviolent civil resistance beginning March 30th, 2020, March 30th, 2018, excuse me.
Just the March of return?
Yes. And just to look at that, if you read the UN Commission of Inquiry report, which ran to 220 pages, single spaced, they conclude that in the face of this overwhelmingly nonviolent civil resistance, Israel targeted children, targeted journalists, targeted medical personnel, targeted people with physical disabilities, people in wheelchairs, 300 meters away from the perimeter fence were targeted by Israel. And so now to get to your question, if you've exhausted all possibilities, and you see, because this is now completely forgotten, by October 2023, Gaza was no longer an item in international politics. In 2023, the only question at that time was whether or not the Saudis would join the Abraham Accords. I know from personal experience that Gaza had disappeared because I was the last stalwart soldier chronicling Gaza, and I had given up. As you both know, the last book I had written before this one was on cancel culture. I had given up on Gaza. Everybody had given up on Gaza. And now you had a very real possibility that if you take the young men who breached the gates of Gaza on October 7th, they were born into, because they were young, they were 20, 21. They were born into a concentration camp, if we're to believe Giora Island. They were languishing in a concentration camp, and they were fated and destined to die in that concentration camp. And they basically did, so far as I could tell, their vision was very narrow in the physical sense and in the metaphorical sense, because as the head of Hamas at that time, Yahya Sinwar, put it, he served 20 years in Israeli prison. He was then released, and as he said, I went from one prison to the next.
Norman, excuse me for interrupting. Like John, I don't like to interrupt. I don't think you're answering his question. I think you're answering a different question, which is why did Hamas undertake the actions that it undertook?
Okay, then maybe I'm misunderstanding the question.
His question is, what did you want Israel to do after having been attacked in October 7, 2020?
What should Israel have done differently?
Oh, what should Israel have done differently? That question, it seems to me, is pretty straightforward. Israel should have obeyed international law. Israel should have lifted the illegal, inhuman, medieval siege of Gaza. Israel should have, as in July 2025, the International Court of Justice ruled, or rendered an advisory opinion, Israel's occupation was illegal. It had only one right, and that was the right to pack up and leave. Or as the court put it, they had to leave as rapidly as possible. That's their only right.
It's like asking, what should the Jews in a concentration camp, maybe if they had risen up against the Nazi guards that was trying to exterminate them or exterminating them, it's like asking, what should the Nazis have done if those prisoners had risen up and killed many of those guards? What should it have done? It might seem like an analogy that doesn't work, but if you look at it in principle, it's the same thing. Now, I'm still going to say what Hamas did was terrible, targeting civilians and all that. But the spirit of it was, we have lost all hope. We cannot continue like this in perpetuity. We have tried non-violence means. We were shot at. So if we're going to die, we better go out in a bang. In a sense, that was their thinking. So what should the Nazi guards have done? Their only response should have been to end that concentration camp, was to let the prisoners go. The Nazis do not have a right of response in that situation. They don't, and if they responded, no one would be defending them. That what do you expect the Nazis to have done? The prisoners, took some guns and attacked them and killed some guards. It's horrific. The only right that the Nazis have was to end the atrocities that they were committing that led to whatever uprising.
With Sinwar still in power.
Excuse
With
me?
Sinwar still in power, Sinwar still vowing to blow up the country.
I genuinely find this question perplexing. I'm not trying to be coy. I have just described a people who had been immured in a concentration camp, born into it, lived in it, and were destined to die in it. And you seem to think the only relevant question is the political status of the resistance to that concentration camp. Whereas it seems to me the primary question should be the accountability of those who imposed that concentration camp on the people of Gaza, one half of whom are children. Israel, in my opinion, had forfeited any right to self-defense after what it had done to the people of Gaza. I don't believe, and you may not like the analogy, but in my current book, I developed it at some length. I don't believe that Israel had any more right to even punish the leadership of Gaza. Let's leave aside the population. Then the state of Virginia had the right to kill Nat Turner. I don't think they had that right. I don't. I think the slave system was such that it forfeited any right of punishment on those who, in an act of desperation, and I believe the people of Gaza, as I was about to say, and I'm not faulting you for interfering with me, I'm just saying, I was about to say, their vision was very narrow. All they could think was, we're going to try this. It's a roll of the dice. And as much as you search, Nat Turner had all sorts of ideas. He thought he could inspire a rebellion among all the slaves in the South. And
Do
he was
you
that
really
particular-
believe that these two situations are that parallel?
Oh, yes, I have no problem. If you would like to go with me into the details, I would be happy to go into them with you.
In saying that Israel shouldn't have responded, and I understand what you mean, that morally they shouldn't have responded, you're making a very sophisticated argument. I get where you're coming from, but that's very abstract.
I don't think that's abstract.
Oh,
One of the things that was very striking.
How so? How is that abstract? Occupation, slavery, they are akin to one another. When people do not have the political right to determine their own future, when they are sieged in, when they are, just imagine moving from one Palestinian village to the other and you have to go through Israeli checkpoints. Now, you can say the reason why those checkpoints exist is for the safety of Israelis. But the Israelis are not supposed to be there to begin with. Take, for example, the West Bank and how it's been carved up, and how Israel continues to annex more and more land. And many of those checkpoints are there to protect Israeli settlers who, under international law, are illegal there. They're not supposed to be there. So what are you talking about? If someone in his own land cannot really move from one village to the other without being assaulted, without being made to go through, scrutiny, what is that? How can you say his analogy is abstract in that sense? Just as slaves could not freely move without their master's permission, just as they had a restriction to what they can do to their liberty, it's the same thing. People don't have to be in literal chains before you think that it's a dire situation that they're in. And this is not an endorsement of what they did. It is terrible. It's not an endorsement. It's an explanation, sort of. So the question should go back to John. What should the Palestinians have done? They've tried political means, they've tried peaceful means, they've tried every other thing. Nothing seems to be working. What should they have done?
About the Nat Turner Rebellion, which remember evoked and provoked a lot of outrage in the South. One
Of
of the
course.
things, one of the things that's most striking about it, and for me resonated comparing the two situations, was blacks in the South. I know they weren't called African Americans back then. Black slaves in the South, they weren't outraged at what Nat Turner did. He became a folk hero, a folk legend. As Stephen Oakes points out in his book on Nat Turner, he said Black people would always refer to, quote, old Nat's war. It wasn't abstract for them. They understood that you can be appalled by the atrocities that occurred during Nat Turner's rebellion, but still respect and honor the memory of somebody who fought because his humanity and dignity had been denied him. And that's the reason why Frederick Douglass, who, as you know, strongly believed in the notion of moral suasion, he was against violence, as were all the abolitionists, except people like John Brown. Frederick Douglass, now remember, Nat Turner smashed the skull, not him personally, he killed only one person, but it's true. Smashed the skulls of women. They did behead babies, which did not happen on October 7th. Still, you know what Frederick Douglass said about Nat Turner? Quote, he was one of our revolutionary fathers and one of our glorious martyrs. And then years later, W.E.B. Du Bois said the same thing about Nat Turner. So my arguments are not at all abstract.
Norman, excuse me again for interrupting. I'm following you. Of course, Nat Turner is celebrated in heroic words by people who hated slavery, especially Black people. As I can imagine, the Hamas militants will be celebrated in the lore of the Palestinians going forward, generations in the future. The question at hand is, what are we to think of these actions? And whether or not we retain any compass of moral judgment that allows us to separate the political aspirations of an oppressed people, on the one hand, from the heinous actions that might be undertaken by those who are fighting on their behalf.
Well, I've said my opinion on many other programs, and so I don't want to, just repeat myself. My view is, when I first alighted on the analogy between the Nat Turner Rebellion and what happened in Gaza, that was only step one. Step two was, okay, the situations, in my mind, you can disagree, the situations were roughly analogous. And again, I say you can disagree. I think they're roughly analogous. But then you have a second question. The situations are roughly analogous, and what moral judgment do you render? And that's a separate question. And there, I immediately turn to individuals who I have the highest regard for from that era. People like William Lloyd Garrison, people like Charles Sumner, people like Frederick Douglass. And I was genuinely curious as to the moral judgment they rendered. And their judgment, as I understood it, and here, instead of quoting Frederick Douglass, who I've already quoted, Charles Sumner, who was really a stupendous historical figure, a person of monumental erudition, very impressive. I read through about 12 of his 20 collected volumes, and it's every speech. You'll be surprised to learn he gave 3 to 5 hour speeches in the Senate, and he memorized every word.
Yeah.
He memorized every word. I mean, this guy was a stupendous figure. And he was asked at one point what he thought of John Brown, because he was already active in political life. In 1831, he was not active when the Nat Turner Rebellion occurred. And he replied, well, Nat Turner was a bit of a fanatic, he said. which is true. If you read Frederick Douglass's autobiographies, he says that when he went to visit John Brown, he said, John Brown was obsessed, as he should have been, as a normal human being should be. But he was obsessed by slavery and how it has to be ended. And you know what? Frederick Douglass said at one point, John Brown starts showing him his plans, constitutional plans, and this and that. And Douglass says, you know what? He was kind of a bore, B-O-R-E. He was obsessed, and I grant, with Charles Sumner to the point of fanaticism, but I don't believe fanaticism in the service of justice is necessarily a bad quality, but we'll leave that aside. But Sumner says, you have to admire the man. He says, now remember, Sumner was a stickler about the Constitution. He was a trained lawyer, and he was obsessed with the fine points of law. And obviously, John Brown was guilty of treason, armed uprising against the national government. But then you know what Sumner said? He said, why can't I separate the man from the act? The act I can't support. As a strict constitutionalist, of course, you can't support treason. But he says, you have to admire the guy. He was struggling for freedom. For Black people, by the way, as a white person. He gave over his entire life to it.
Can you understand why we African Americans might be a little bit slow to embrace the equivalency that you've drawn between the institution of slavery on the one hand and the fact of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories on the other?
Well, remember, first of all, I can understand anyone disagreeing with me. I don't have a problem with that. The problem is, you see, sometimes you use euphemistic language, which then makes the analogy look not exactly right. So you describe it as an occupation. And of course, there can be different degrees of an occupation. I'm talking about a situation that began in 1948. The population of Gaza was overwhelmingly, to the present, from 1948. It comprised refugees, people who had lost their homes. And then half the population of Gaza at any given point has comprised of children.
Don't upload your song before this last step. Mastering makes your track sound finished.
So, having said that, I'm going to make another point to you relevant to what you just asked me. And as you know, look, you're both trained scholars. Analogies are always imperfect. We know that. What's the importance of an analogy is if there are significant dimensions or facets which are similar or analogous. Any two situations, and as any fifth grader can tell you, have to differ in terms of time and space. That's inevitable in any two situations.
Norman, do you think?
Well, I'll just complete the thought.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me when I was reading W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction was he tried to take an objective view of the situation, as any sociologist would want to do. And he said in Black Reconstruction, you may be outraged at this. He said, you know what? There were some redeeming aspects to slavery. He said it had built into it a kind of old age pension system. So as you know, one of the things that outraged Frederick Douglass was that he alleged that his slaveholder, Captain Auld, he said that he had thrown his mother out when she was no longer able to work. And Captain Auld took great offense at that. This is when they were still just corresponding before Douglas met Captain Auld. He said, "That's not true. I took care of her." And Douglas then acknowledged, yes, it turns out you did take care of her. And so Du Bois says, yeah, there were some things, it had a built-in old age pension system, slavery. And then you ask yourself, then what is the horror? How do you capture in words? And that's an interesting question. How do you capture in words the essence of slavery that makes it such an appalling crime against humanity? And Du Bois said it was not the material element, it was the moral element, the degradation of a human being. That to him, now I'm not saying Du Bois is the last word, but I'm saying that roughly speaking, analogies being imperfect, I do believe, and it's not meant in any way to diminish the horrors of slavery, it's rather to cast light on the horrors that befell the people of Gaza beginning in 1948, which is something very different. I couldn't even conceive diminishing the magnitude of the crime that African Americans
Norman,
have.
you seem to think that your view of what happened from 1948 to 1967 is just the ineradicable, pristine, and I'm not trying to be abusive at all, but you seem to think that there's a truth about that, like that 2 + 2 = 4. This happened, that happened, and I understand your argument.
Of course, that's his argument. He has to believe his points are correct, and if you look at it, they are corroborated by historical facts. So except you have a point of disagreement, just stating that he seems to think that his version of events is correct, just making that statement makes absolutely no sense. If there are points that you have identified in his arguments that are inaccurate, then it behoves on you to point them out. But if you're not going to point them out, then it's unnecessary.
I mean, we've heard this a lot lately, that the Hamas uprising was unfortunate but inevitable. I get what you mean. But then a person looks back and thinks, well, where did it all start? Why did the situation happen that way? And your view seems to be that the Israelis have been treating the Palestinians the way Afrikaners treated Africans in South Africa. And I just don't see it. I think 1948 to 1967 is much more complicated than I'm sensing you seem to think.
Well,
It's much more complicated, and when he was trying to unpack the situation by giving a nuanced answer, you objected to that. If it's much more complicated than that, then asking simplistic questions like what should the Israelis have done after October 7th and demanding a very simple answer doesn't track logically. This is something that McWhorter does a lot. He wants to shroud things in. Oh, it's a very complex situation. It's a very complex situation. We can't fully understand it. We cannot fully grasp it. It's very complex. Yes, so things are complex. Complex things can be broken down and they can be made understandable. You can break it down. And it was what Norman was trying to do, because it is a complex situation. You find two groups of people who are essentially competing for the same piece of land. To varying degrees, they have some sort of ties to that land. There is no doubt that Jews have ties to that land, right? And there is no doubt that Palestinians have ties to that land. They've been there all along, right? European Jews would claim that their ancestors were there 2,000 years ago, and on the basis of that, they're returning. So those are two competing claims. And also note that the Jews were fleeing persecution. They were literally fleeing for their lives. So I understand why they would want to create a safe haven. And I understand why they would want to go to Palestine to create that. But what I do not understand is doing it at the expense of another people by instituting almost the same system that you were running away from in the land that you just came to. That's what really boggles my mind about Israel, is the fact that Jews had gone through a lot, through so many, horrors in Europe. And just when they have the opportunity, when they have the opportunity to be in position of power, what are they going to do? They're not going to learn from their history. They're going to, well, let's just be like the guys who treated us badly and treat these same people that we're meeting here. Let's treat them badly. Does it make any sense? The answer is no.
I don't want to be boastful, but I have written many books on the situation, beginning with the beginnings of Zionism. My doctoral dissertation was entitled "From the Jewish Question to the Jewish State: An Essay on the Theory of Zionism." So I don't believe that I am
You're an expert.
bandying about slogans.
No, you are an expert on it.
I think I said to you, I was not conveying my opinion. I was struck by the consistency of the opinions of both foreign observers who worked in Gaza and then of Israelis in positions of power. I could also quote to you academics. On the specific question of apartheid of South Africa, I was also struck that in 1991, Professor Edward Said for the first time visited Gaza, and he was familiar, cognizant of the situation in South Africa. And he said, quote, "Nothing I saw in South Africa remotely compared to the abject horror of Gaza." So you say, well, what do you expect Edward Said to say? But then I say, you have a problem. Edward Said says it at one end of the spectrum. Giora Island says it at the other end of the spectrum. Mary Robinson, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, she says it when she visits Gaza in 2008. And then even magazines like The Economist described Gaza in 2022 as, quote, a sinking ship.
Whose fault was that?
Yeah, that's the question. That's the thing that John is trying to draw you out on. Saying there's an argument, Norman, about...
John thinks he has asked a gotcha question. Whose fault was that? Well, it's the fault of the people who kicked them out of their land and pushed them into a concentration camp. That's the simple answer. And that's the only correct answer.
Not about the facts of what has gone on, but about the responsibilities, the opportunities missed for a two-state solution, for example. The fact that the Israelis pulled out of Gaza in 2005 and so on. The fact that Hamas has become a tyrannical, authoritarian, et cetera, and they're sitting on Israel's border, and et cetera. I mean,
okay.
It's not like I want to go down into the depths of the disputation. I want an acknowledgement, however, that there is a disputation.
Glenn, first of all, I have no problem with you putting to me the tough questions. That's your job. The issue of, there are two aspects to your question. One, who was responsible? And two, is it a matter of controversy and disputation, or is there a broad consensus? So let me answer those questions together. As you know, there are a huge number of economic organizations and humanitarian organizations and UN organizations that operate in Gaza. Everything from the World Bank to the International Monetary Fund to Oxfam to UNICEF and 100, literally 100 others, okay?
This is a situation that I really don't understand, because yeah, the humanitarian organizations in Gaza, they're spending billions of dollars every year, if not, trying to help the situation in Gaza. And to me, that's a band aid. The fact that people are starving in Gaza, the fact that people do not have access to medicines and all that, and they have to be provided for by foreign aid agencies. The problem is not that those are naturally occurring conditions, that the Palestinians are helpless, that's just their state. I should it not even call your attention to that there is a massive problem here if these people are predominantly dependent on foreign aid for decades. If they've been predominantly dependent on foreign aid for decades, doesn't that highlight to you that there is a problem? And that problem should at its roots be fixed. So this is a band-aid. The problem is the occupation. The problem is the siege. This is more like a medieval siege on a people. That's the problem. Yes, Israel physically pulled out of Gaza in 2007, but then instituted a sort of a blockade. So the only thing they did was just to remove their citizens from being physically present in Gaza, which now made it even much easier for them to control Gaza. So what actually changed? What changed? Let these people have the right to determine their own future. And I'm certain that if they do have that, then there wouldn't be a need for aid agencies to be operating in Gaza for 100 years. There wouldn't be a need for all that. So the fact that that's what's happening shows there is a problem.
There was a consensus by all of them. The economy in Gaza crashed because of the blockade of Gaza, because of that illegal medieval blockade of Gaza. You know, that blockade was so lunatic. They barred chocolate from entering Gaza. They barred baby chicks from entering Gaza. They barred cinnamon and other condiments from entering Gaza.
So let's look at the Israeli argument here. Well, the reason we're instituting this blockade is because Hamas will use these things to create bombs and weapons to attack Israel. Okay, so please tell me how chocolates do that. Tell me how baby chicks. Tell me how cinnamon. These are basic food ingredients. Tell me how Hamas is going to use any of those things to create weapons. And remind you that this was before Hamas even carried out any acts of violence against the state of Israel. So if you're saying that the reason why the blockade was instituted was because of Hamas, they're just terrible militant fanatics and all that. But that's not historically accurate. One might even argue that it is the pressures of the blockade that forced Hamas into this sort of militancy against the state of Israel.
The list was so long of the items that were prohibited from entering Gaza that at some point the list was revised in order to just name the items you can bring into Gaza. Now, why did they do that? They were very straightforward about it, and both of you are politically sophisticated enough to figure it out. You remember in 1974, when the Popular Unity government came into power in Chile. 1971, excuse me, 1971. And our government didn't like that. It was led by Salvador Allende. And Henry Kissinger said, we're going to keep turning the screws on Allende, Popular Unity, until the economy screams. Now, we all know that tactic, the application of brutal sanctions in order to get your adversary to cry uncle. And Israel imposed the same brutal blockade on Gaza. So If you ask me who is responsible, I don't think there is any, you'll excuse me, I don't believe there's any disputation. I've read all of those reports by the international economic and humanitarian organizations. The consensus is across the board. It was that blockade of Gaza that was responsible for the collapse of Gaza's economy.
Nigeria's energy story is changing. Investment is growing.
Okay.
If you don't agree with me, I would strongly recommend, and I'm not trying to be pedantic about it, I would strongly recommend you read Sarah Roy's book. She's the world's leading authority on Gaza. She's at Harvard, the Middle Eastern Studies division. She's actually Jewish. Her parents were both survivors of Auschwitz.
Norman, do you think that Hamas's government wasn't shunting resources away from ordinary people in favor of spending a lot of that money on other things, like tunnels? Is this a crazy argument?
First of all, I think it would be it's a bit what you can call it presumptuous for we as Americans to criticize others for squandering our precious national resources on the military.
Norman.
Well, you're changing the subject, though.
No, I'm not changing the subject. The people of Gaza, first of all, they elected Hamas. They elected Hamas. As Jimmy Carter, who was there in January 2006, said, it was a fully fair and free election. In fact, it was the first fair and free election in the Arab Muslim world.
But they didn't know how it was going to go. But they didn't know what the future was going to be.
Yeah, well, they certainly didn't know. They didn't predict, because if we're here, since we're a serious audience, do you know who imposed that election? That election was imposed by George Bush. That was the era, which everybody has, of course, forgotten. It was called democracy promotion. They had no idea that when they did what they were ordered to do, namely participate in a democratic election, and then they elected a party which promised reform because the Palestinian Authority was so hopelessly corrupt, that they would be punished for doing as they were told, to participate in a democratic election. And it is true. Here I will grant naivete on the part of the Palestinian population, which, as I said, lives in the very narrow universe. They didn't know that that was going to result in a brutal blockade of Gaza. That wasn't to be predicted. Should we blame the people of Gaza for exercising their democratic right to elect into office a party that promised reform and which, in the social sectors before the election, and this is, Sarah Roy actually wrote a whole book on the subject, they were pretty honest. They ran the charities. They ran all sorts of social agencies. They were fairly honest. Now, it became corrupt, as is almost inevitable under the situation of siege. I recognize that. But they were never given a chance. So it's hard for me to condemn them for all sorts of corruption when, number one, they were never given a chance. And number two, one can say in retrospect that maybe they should have prepared better for the armed onslaught that they faced after October 7. But I find it really odd that people should criticize Gaza or Hamas should criticize Hamas for attempting to protect itself, not just after October 7th. You have to know the history. There was Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. There was Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. There was Operation Protective Edge in 2014. When Operation Protective Edge was over, and all of these operations, they're just high-tech killing sprees, or as Israel likes to call them in what I consider a rather pathological metaphor, when you consider that half of Gaza's population are children, they called it mowing the lawn.
So given that history, given that Israel routinely goes into Gaza to kill people, what should the Palestinians have done? That's a question I don't see John asking, because he has asked, after the atrocities of October 7th, what should Israel have done? Israel had to respond one way or another. So after all those onslaughts, routinely, which even now it's still going on, civilians are still being killed in Gaza, what should the Palestinians do?
As in the blades of a mower cracking the skulls of a population, half of whom are children, I think a really sick metaphor. But by the end of Operation Protective Edge, the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, he toured Gaza, and he left and he said after touring Gaza, and remember, his job is to tour war zones. That's the job description of the head of the ICRC. He said, quote, "I've never in my life seen destruction on the order of what I saw in Gaza. Never in my life." Just to give your listeners some insight to what happened in the last 3 years. In 2014, Israel destroyed 18,000 homes in Gaza. As of the latest report by the World Bank, Israel has destroyed in the past 3 years 325,000 homes in Gaza. In 2014, what the head of the ICRC said, "I've never seen destruction on that level in my life." Israel left behind 2.5 million tons of rubble. You know how many tons of rubble are now in Gaza? 61 million tons of rubble in Gaza.
So what should the Palestinians do given these situations? Given that in 2014, 18,000 homes were destroyed. Why are you destroying people's homes? Why are you destroying people's homes? Okay, there are terrorists in that house. You've gone in, you've taken out the terrorists. You have to destroy the home. What should the Palestinians have done? Question to John McWhorter.
It's going to take forever to get it out of there. And that leads me to want to ask you, Norman, what do you see looking forward for the future? You think Israel has accomplished its goals in Gaza? You don't want to call it war. You wanted to call it genocide and, in effect, ethnic cleansing. What's the future of the Gazans? You don't like the Board of Peace, I gathered, and your trust in international institutions to be able to administer some kind of ameliorative effect is diminished. What do you see going forward?
As I say, they like to quote this famous writer, Romain Rolland, who said, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will." I am pessimistic of the intellect. I'm not sure where I stand on the will, though I keep fighting. Doesn't make much difference to me if it produces results. You fight because it's right, and not because there's a guarantee that it's going to produce the results that you wish that it produces. Though I have to enter the caveat, the second one, I did walk away after 2020. That's a fact. and I don't want to deny that fact. So I did give up. But what do I see? Israel hasn't achieved its main goal. Its goal was very clear from day one. Its goal was to empty out Gaza, to do a 1948 all over again, and to empty out Gaza. And the means they chose were genocidal, targeting part or the whole of the population for destruction in order to force them to leave. So they haven't achieved that yet. They're right now, basically what's happening is the conditions remain intolerable in Gaza to maintain the minimum humanitarian level, 150 trucks have to enter Gaza each day. On average now, about 76 trucks enter each day. So it's a sub-minimum standard that they're now being held to, the people in Gaza. And then there's a second element. There's no future. There's not going to be any reconstruction in Gaza until the people leave. Can anyone in his or her right mind possibly believe that after Israel spent the last 3 years pulverizing, reducing to dust and rubble Gaza, they're now going to turn around and hold hands, chant Om, give peace a chance, and reconstruct Gaza? That's not going to happen. The Board of Peace has no power. It's Donald Trump's plaything. That's built into it. The UN washed its hands of Gaza. You perhaps know the case of King Leopold, who the Conference of Berlin granted total control over the Congo. It became his plaything. He literally owned the deed to the Congo. And the course of what he called bringing lightness to darkness in Africa, about 15, the estimates are 10 to 15 million Congolese were killed between the rubber trade and the ivory trade. Or I should say ivory and then rubber trade. And now the UN Security Council, it gave the deed of Gaza to Donald Trump. If you look at its current structure, Donald Trump has veto power over any decision made by the Board of Peace. He has veto power over any decision. And in addition, the UN, the only thing the UN Security Council asked of Donald Trump is every 6 months, you should, it didn't even say you have to, you should send us a report on what's going on. That's it. And Donald Trump's not going to rebuild Gaza. He's already said, I think the people will be happier elsewhere.
You've probably seen videos like these blowing up all over social media. Well, the good news is that you can create them yourself.
So we can call it not a work in progress. It's a genocide in progress. It hasn't yet achieved its ultimate goal. Although we have to acknowledge the facts. The magnitude of the horror has been to some extent diminished. Israel kills since the ceasefire in October, kills on average 1 person a day, which is significantly lower than before. And by August 2025, the main body, the IPC, responsible for monitoring starvation, food insecurity, and famine, by August 2025, the IPC was saying that there were famine conditions in Gaza Governorate, which was the first time, by the way, such an alert had been issued.
Norman, if I asked you to be a little more specific on why you think that this is a genocide rather than a hideous disaster, which it is, I think from the things you've been saying over this past hour, you're going to say, well, people have said it. And I will say, okay, let's say Bezalel Smotrich said it, but he is who he is. And let's say, I'm aware of 2 other people who have...
No. He's not who he is. He's a high-ranking member of the Israeli government saying genocidal stuff. And you can't just dismiss his statements by saying that he's one man. No. The president of Israel has said that it is an entire civilization in Gaza that's responsible for this. Journalists in Israel are literally laughing and saying, "Oh, we're destroying their homes or destroying their villages." Israeli citizens there are polls that show that a majority of Israeli citizens support the destruction going on in Gaza. So it is not you're just quoting people out of context, you're just quoting one or two persons. No, this is official policy by the Israeli government. Yeah, the Israeli politicians have said that there are no uninvolved civilians in Gaza. So what are you talking about?
Said it from the beginning, who are ultra-right, unorthodox, and kind of hothead personalities. But, there's always flutter, which is something that you've been saying too. These things aren't tidy. Other than those three, and let's say there are four, where do you get such surety that what's going on is King Leopold and Hitler and South Africa, rather than a hideous, complex miasma based on the situation in 1948? Genuine question.
Well, I don't think King Leopold.
This sort of genuine question can only arise from a persistent ignorance on the part of John McWhorter, who, despite being involved in conversations around this conflict for 3 years now, has refused to update himself or his knowledge on the situations on ground. Or this is not a genuine question. It's a deflection. Anybody can go out there and ask, what is the definition of a genocide? And people seem to think that a genocide means just killing everybody. Well, that's not true. The first definition of genocide involves destruction of a population in whole or in part of an ethnic, religious, or ethnic religious identity in whole or in part, or subjecting them to such conditions as to, almost want to destroy them. So it doesn't mean you have to destroy everybody in Gaza before it becomes a genocide. And yes, these people have been destroyed in part. People are going to ignore the definitions and try to make it hyperbolic to say, well, everyone in Gaza isn't dead yet, so it can't be a genocide.
Committed the genocide. His intention, well, you could say neither in means nor ends could it be described as a genocide.
No. Unjustified murder.
Mega death. There's nothing quite like it, actually. At least I'm not aware of death and destruction on that scale. It was between 1891 and 1913, I believe. I'm not aware of mega deaths.
So the definition is this. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic destruction in whole or in part of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And whatever Israel is doing right now fit this definition very clearly. They are being deliberate in their targeting of Gaza. It is systematic, and it is aimed at destroying the population in total, but right now it's destroying it in part. And the Palestinians are being targeted in this sense for their national or ethnic identity, or even their religious identity. So I don't understand how people cannot understand the simple concept of what genocide is.
On that scale, but I'm not sure I would call it a genocide. So to turn to your
I just observed that you're not alone, Norman, in calling it a genocide. And I don't just mean the international organizations. I mean the tenor of American politics right now, in which those kinds of representations are being used by a wide swath of the political spectrum. So,
by the way, Glenn, it's Jews. The latest poll shows 30% of American Jews, 30% believe Israel was carrying out a genocide in Gaza. So it's pretty pervasive, that belief. I myself have to say, I take a certain amount as a Jew, and I'm not a practicing Jew, but I take a certain amount of pride that given the bombardment of propaganda that Jews are recipients of, and over a very long period, the loyalties to Israel, that fully 30%, roughly 1/3 of American Jews, have enough lucidity of mind and moral refinement to say, well, Yeah, we think it's a genocide. But let's leave that aside.
Which is something that I would commend the Jewish population of America. They seem to be different from the Jewish Israelis, who are, in my mind, just they are another breed of. I really don't understand their thinking. I don't understand the way they perceive and do things. It's entirely different. Now, if the situations were reversed, is it possible that all the Arabs might be, if the Arabs were at fault here, is it possible that majority of Arabs might be supporting the Palestinians if they were at fault here? It's possible. It is possible. So it is commendable that, as Norman has put it, that Jewish Americans have the lucidity of thoughts to be able to step back from the conflict, put their own biases in place, and they're able to speak truth to power, to say what people are doing in the name of my identity is terrible, is wrong, and should not continue.
Because the question is not for me to quote others at this point, but to make my own case. The first point to make is I think you're quite mistaken if you think it's only a handful of people. There's been a very large compendium of statements across Israeli society, the full spectrum from left to right and top to bottom, of kind of horrifying genocidal statements that have issued forth, not just in the heat of battle in October 7th, but for many years thereafter, or we should say many months and as many as 3 years coming October, statements by the government. But then there is the actual actions. And here, and you'll forgive me, I never like to mention a book I've written because it sounds like I'm trying to exploit, in this case, a horror of significant magnitude. But I devote a whole chapter of the book to attacking human rights organizations, Amnesty International in particular. And it's called Laws of War or Logic of Genocide. Are we dealing with a war or are we dealing with genocide? Now, it may surprise some of your listeners. The two are almost opposites. In a war, what's your goal? What's your objective? To inflict a military defeat on the opposing army. Civilians may get killed, for sure, and sometimes civilians are targeted, terror bombing, to break the morale of your enemy. But at the end of the day, your goal or objective is to inflict a military defeat, and whatever civilian casualties result are secondary. I'm not saying they're insignificant, but they're secondary. A genocide is just the opposite. You're trying to annihilate, destroy the civilian population, and the military aspect is secondary. So now we turn to the question of Gaza. First of all, there are basic questions to be asked. A large number of human rights reports have now established, I believe credibly, that Israel's targeting children. They target them in the head, they target them in the chest, they target them with drones, they target them with, it seems, quadcopters, which is a version of a drone.
Norman, I'm going to take a gamble here, and I'm going to say that I'll bet that's not true.
Yeah.
Well, you can.
Your bet, that's the best that John McWhorter could come up with. I'll bet that's not true. Where is your evidence for that claim that's not true? And this just shows me how divorced from reality John McWhorter is. He's so sheltered in his bubble, in his academic bubble. He's not even bothered to check out these things. I'll bet that's not true. That's the response coming from an academic. Guessing, you just, oh my God.
I'll bet that can be debunked. I'm just going to bet.
Yeah, please, you bet it's going to be debunked. Well, then go ahead, debunk it. Go ahead. Just don't state it. I'll bet. Are you a gambler?
Bet whatever you want. I'm not a bettor by nature. I hoard money. I don't bet it. But
the question is whether they're targeting children. We can ask Eli what he has to say about that.
You can ask whatever you want. I'm saying, I prefaced my remarks by saying there has been a large number of human rights reports addressing that specific question. You will recall, because I believe you write for the New York Times, and the New York Times ran an op-ed by 64 doctors and nurses who served in Gaza. And they made the claim that Israel was targeting children because it was clean single bullet shots to the head or the chest, no signs of shrapnel. And then, as you recall, the Times came under a lot of attack for running that article. And what did the Times say? We looked at the x-rays. We looked at the evidence. There was just no getting around it.
No, Norman, there was more intelligent pushback against that than that. And we don't have time to get into it, but
no, why not? Why not? Why not get into it? There's time. There's literally time.
Standing truth.
Well,
let me get your. I mean, we just have a few minutes. I don't want to shortchange Eli for his time, but what are you making of the dramatic shift within the Democratic Party and broader in attitudes toward Israel, and how you think that interacts with the question of what's going to happen in Gaza going forward?
New Tasty Tom fries well, blends well, shines in the moment.
I work with data in all sorts of different ways. It's such a rich medium.
Well, my own view is, speaking about inevitabilities, what happened in Gaza, I think at some point in time, it was going to happen. Israel had carried on in a too brazen, too outrageous way, too confident that it could rely on the United States not only for ammunition, not only for weapons, but could rely on it to block any international action on behalf of the victims of the Israeli genocide. And they carried on in a very outrageous, brazen, flagrant way. We won't have time to discuss it now, and I don't want to raise a topic which you feel like I'm not giving you time to answer, so it could be for another day. The Jewish billionaire supremacist class, it destroyed academic freedom in our country. After the crushing of the encampments on the college campuses, a reign of terror settled on the college campuses across the country. 3, not 1, not 2, 3 Ivy League presidents were ousted from office. And that breeds, and I don't want to go into everything else that happened, the suspensions, the expulsions, the deportations, the threats of deportations.
You're right. That's the subject for another conversation, which we should definitely have.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just say.
Because if you leave Finkelstein, dude is going to talk forever.
Between the horrors in Gaza, the inability to control what was being done in Gaza because of the advent of the internet, and the flagrant, brazen, outrageous carryings on, which continue to this day with the attempt to buy elections through money, it was inevitable that there would be a backlash, and a backlash of significant magnitude. And I have said on many occasions, I believe there is a danger lurking in that backlash. I recognize that. but recognizing that fact should not make us oblivious to what caused this situation in the first place. And I'll end by saying, just watch Daniela Weiss yesterday on Piers Morgan program. She's one of the settler leaders. She's like a caricature out of Der Stürmer. You listen to her, you watch her. Piers Morgan asked her at least 5 times, do you believe a Palestinian and a Jewish life are equal? And he kept saying just a simple yes or no. Do you believe they're equal? She refused to answer that question. And I thought to myself, this is not great PR for our Jews. Not a good thing. What's a good thing for Jews is when 30% of American Jews find the courage, the conviction, and the honesty to acknowledge that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Norman.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So it's a terrible situation. I think it's a terrible situation. But what I just see from this is John McWhorter it's oh my God, I'm really irritated by John McWhorter because he has this air of, I can't describe the feeling exactly that I get from John McWhorter, but dude is a lightweight, in the words of Glenn Lowry when he's talking about Ibram X. Kendi. John McWhorter is a lightweight. That's the way I'll put it, and he's no match for someone like Norman Finkelstein. Now you can get tired with Norman's meandering, and he likes to build a case. There's a lot of preamble before he answers his question. But if you listen properly, if you listen very well to what he's saying, he's just trying to build context for you to understand. He's unlike Jonathan Peterson. He's going to stay on point. He'll stay on point even though he brings in a lot of things. He'll stay on point. Unlike Jordan Peterson, where by the end of the conversation you're lost, you don't know where you're coming from and where you're going to. He's quite different in that regard. So, John, please go and do some more reading, which I don't think you're doing. I think John is just winging things, just trying to common sense things, like his how would I put it, his intellectual son, Coleman Hughes, who's to me is just a massive disgrace. Had so much potential, had so much. I had so much. It's just a massive disgrace at this point in time. Anyway, I think that's about it for today. Like, share, and subscribe. And Luke Bovine, Samael, thanks for coming to the conversation today. I'll see you in another live stream, which might be in a few minutes time because there's something else I want to talk about. So it's bye for now.